In the previous lesson, you learned how to read the contents of a file, and you also briefly looked at writing to a file. Although we didn't really write anything, we just used the function in order to create the file if it didn't exist. But we will get to writing to files in a later lesson. For now, I want to focus on the data that we have now, because since we have data, we might as well go ahead and display this data. So this is what we have. We have just a JSON structure. Now, if you're not familiar with JSON or JavaScript, it's really quite simple. What we have, essentially, I'm going to use PHP terms here. So if you are familiar with JavaScript, I'm going to be wrong. So what we essentially have is an array of associative arrays. So the syntax, we have square brackets. We have been using those throughout this course. So that is our array. But whenever you see these curly braces, then this would be the logical equivalent of an associative array in PHP. So we have a key and then a value, and then a key and then a value. And that is one of our items. Then we have another item. We have a key and a value and a key and a value. So that's the idea here, except that in JavaScript, this isn't an associative array because JavaScript doesn't have associative arrays. Instead, these are objects. Now, PHP has objects, and we are going to be working with objects in this lesson. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just focus on what we have as far as our data. We want to turn this, because this is just a string whenever we get the data from the file. We want to turn that string into something that we can use within our application. And that's called parsing. We're going to parse the string. So let's change this to JSON because that's what we have. And so whenever we have JSON, we want to parse it. So let's create a variable called items. And no, let's do terms. And then we will call a function simply called JSON decode, and then we pass in our JSON. So this is the main reason why I chose JSON as the data format here, because every language and every platform now has built-in JSON capabilities. PHP is one of those. So by using this simple function, we have taken the JSON that we read from the file, and with terms, we have now created an array of objects that we can work with inside of PHP. So I am passing those terms to our view as its model. So let's go to our view so that we can start displaying this stuff. Now remember that inside of our view, we refer to our model as model. That is the variable name that is used inside of that view function. So what we want to do is loop over our model, because that's what we have. We have individual items within an array. So we want to use a for each. So we will say for each, and we will say model as, we can call this item. And then we want to output our data. Now, here's the thing when it comes to using objects. We could do echo, and then let's build a table. So before we start building that row, let's have a table with a class of table and table striped. And then we will have our closing table tag after the loop, so that the loop is going to generate a tr element and then two td elements, one for the term and then one for the definition. So we'll have opening and closing td, opening and closing td. So we can come in here and we can say item. But the moment that we start trying to use the syntax for accessing a property on that object, well, then things start to go wrong. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to create a variable. We're going to call this term, and we will say item. Now, the syntax for accessing the properties and the methods on an object is different than what you would find in most other languages. In languages like JavaScript or C#, Java, things like that, you would just have a dot, and then you would type your property name. So our property names are what we have inside of our JSON structure. They are the keys. So we have term and definition, term and definition. So we don't use a dot to access this value. Instead, we have an arrow. It's not what's called a fat arrow, which is what we have been using with associative arrays. It's a skinny arrow. It's a dash and then a closing angle bracket. Now, if you're not familiar with the term object, just think of an object as you would a normal everyday object. Just look at something on your desk or something near you, and if it's a thing, then that's an object. Just think of, a guitar. Here we go with guitars again. A guitar has a color. So that would be a property of the guitar. The amount of strings. So we could have a string count property, because some guitars have 6, some have 7, some have 8, some have 12. There's varying numbers of strings. But then a guitar also has what we could call methods. These are actions. They usually change the state of an object. So, you can turn the volume knob up on a guitar, and that would be making the guitar louder. So we could have a method called make louder, and a method is just like a special function. Basically, you execute it like you would a function, except that it is attached to an object. So you have these things on an object, and in the case of our terms, we have a term property, and then we have a definition property. So item and then definition. I should have used a shorter term, but that's going to be okay. So this is what we are going to have. Now, once again, these names that I've used, term and definition, come from the keys that are specified inside of the JSON file. So that's why I'm using those. If we changed term to hello, then we would use a property called hello over here instead of term. So there you go. All right, so we have our for each. We are going to say term there, and then we are going to say definition there. We need to finish that statement with a semicolon, and there we go. So when we see this in the browser, that's what we have. Although we see that we have a notice, array to string conversion in line 6. So we will need to make note of that. But at least our data is here. We have our term and then the definitions. So line 6, oh yes, we are outputting model. So let's change that to glossary, because that's what we have. So let's refresh, and there we go. Now we can do our loop like this, and that's okay, but I don't particularly like how we have strung all of this together. That just makes this more difficult to have to maintain. So we could write our for each in a different way. So let's move that down just so that we have that. And we're going to use a different type of syntax. We are still going to have a for each, and we're going to put this on the same line as PHP here. But instead of a curly brace here, we have a colon, and then we end that code block. That termination for that code block, we're going to do this. We're going to open up another code block, and we're going to say end for each, semicolon. So that's now inside of our for each and the end for each, we can have HTML. And that makes our code a lot easier to, first of all, read. It also makes it easier to maintain. So now we can come in here, and we don't have to create these individual variables, because we can use our shorthand output syntax, and we can say item and then term. And then we will do the same thing for the definition. So we'll just copy and paste, and then definition. So if we view this in the browser, we are going to get two tables. The first is using that shorter syntax, or the HTML-friendly syntax. I guess that would be the better term. And then we have one that uses the traditional for each, where we echo out just a string. So we have two options. I'm going to opt for this one, because that one makes our output easier to do. And since we are primarily working with HTML inside of our view, it just makes sense to use this type of output. Now, because we have this type of syntax for a for each, it could be implied that, we could do the same thing with an if. If true, then we have colon, we close our PHP code block, and then we say end if to end that if statement, although we need PHP there. So it's the same type of thing. That way we can use our HTML and then we just output the values that we need to output. Okay, so we have our table of glossary terms. Well, let's go back to our code and let's specifically go to index.php because we are doing something here that we are going to do multiple times. Anytime that we are going to display the terms or our list of terms, we are going to be doing the same thing, calling get data and then decoding it. So it makes sense to go ahead and write a function. We could call this get terms, and then we will get our JSON, and then we will simply return JSON decode, and we will pass in JSON. So pretty simple. So that then all we have to do is call our get terms, and that's it. So of course, if we refresh, we get our results. But now we need to think about where we put this get terms function, because we do have a functions PHP file, and it does have two functions. So let's go ahead for right now, and let's put it inside of here. However, I'm also thinking about the future, because we are just now starting this application. We are, of course, going to be writing more functions, and we are going to want to put them someplace. Some of those functions are going to go in here. And the more functions you have inside of a file, the harder it is to find the function that you need if you need to modify it. So it kind of makes sense to start organizing our functions into separate files, so that a file will have just the functions that are related to one another. So for example, we have two functions that are data related. One is reading the file. The other is using that function to read the file to then decode the contents. So we could say that these are data related. Now, I'm also thinking farther into the future whenever we start incorporating MySQL into our application. And we are, of course, going to write functions there. And those are going to be data related. So if we start with a folder called data inside of our app folder, we can put our files that are data related inside of this data folder so that they are separate from all of our other files. So we're going to create a new file inside of data. And since these are dealing with file data, we'll just call this file_functions. We might change that at a future time, but for right now, that's going to be okay. And let's copy and paste. And then let's get rid of these. I copied and pasted so that I wouldn't have to type the opening code block in file functions. Now we need to include this, and all of our includes are inside of app.php. So we will require, and we want data / file_functions.php. And that's the only time we have to include this, because app is included inside of index.php. So we are starting to see the benefit of having this app.php file, especially in the next lesson when we add another controller. So now we don't really even need this terms. We could do something like this. We could just call get terms and pass that as the model to our view, and then we don't have that at all. So we have a pretty clean view now. Although let's go ahead and create our view bag, but let's do this all in one statement so that we have our title. And then for the title, this is our glossary, so let's just say glossary, so that we have a title in our title bar. So we need to make sure that this works. Let's go back, let's refresh, and everything works just fine. Although let's say glossary list, because that's what we have here. So there we go. And now our controller is nice and clean. We don't have any HTML inside of our controller. If we go to our view is nice and clean. And the only logic that we have is our for each, so that we can iterate over our model and output the term and definition. So now, in the next lesson, we are going to have a link for our terms, so that the user can click on the terms. That will take them to a separate page that will then give them more information about those terms. Now, we're not going to have any extra information because we just have a term and a definition. And of course, we can come in and we could add more information if we wanted to. But we're going to keep things simple.